Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shiur. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Megillah. And in today's shiur, Mitzvah Hashem, we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Hey Amud Aleph. We pick up on the very top of Kuf Nun Hey Amud Aleph in Siman Taf Reish Tzadik Sif Vav. Says the Mechaber, HaKorei es HaMegillah lemafreya. If somebody lanes the Megillah, literally lemafreya means backwards. If he lanes the Megillah out of order, lo yotza, you are not yotza. Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Chaf Aleph, lemafreya, you lane the Megillah out of order. Hainu, this means shekara hapsukim ha'achroinim, you laned later psukim, kaidem shekara hapsukim harishainim, before you laned earlier psukim. Va'afilu rak pasuk echad. Even if you did this with regards to only one pasuk, you laned one pasuk out of order, you laned one later pasuk before an earlier pasuk. Ukedelakamei, as we're going to see in the example that the Mechaber is going to give shortly. V'huadin, the same halachah would apply. Heiche shekara parsha shniya kaidem larishaina. Let's say you laned the second parak of the Megillah before you laned the first parak of the Megillah. Now, in this second case, the reason this is a little bit of a bigger chiddush is two reasons. First of all, in that case, you laned the psukim in order. You started with the second parak. You laned all of the psukim contained within the second parak in order. Then you went to the first parak. When you laned the first parak, you also laned all the psukim contained within the first parak in order. But you laned the Megillah out of order because you laned the second parak before you laned the first parak, and therefore it's still a problem. It's still called being karei the Megillah lemafreya, and you're not yotza. Interestingly enough, they ask a question, what's the chiluk between the halachos of Megillah and the halachos of Kriyas Shema? By Kriyas Shema, we find that if you lane the parshas of Kriyas Shema out of order, you are yotza. But if you lane the psukim within one parsha out of order, you're not yotza. So by Kriyas Shema, if you do the parshas out of order, you are yotza. By Megillah, if you do the parshas out of order, you're not yotza. One of the explanations that are given is that we have to realize there's a critical difference between Kriyas Shema and the Megillah. The three parshas of Kriyas Shema are not written in one place in the Torah HaKadoshah. It's not one continual flow in order. One parsha is over here, one parsha is over there, one parsha is over there. The Megillah, the entire Megillah, is written in order. Okay, so we see HaKorei HaMegillah lemafreya lo yotza. Now, what is the source for this? If you take a look at the Beragayla Ois Katan Lamid, this is brought down from a Mishnah in Megillah on Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. This is beferish in the Mishnah, HaKorei HaMegillah lemafreya lo yotza. Why not? So the Gemara darshans this from a pasuk in the Megillah. The pasuk in the Megillah says, V'hayamim ha'ela niskarim ve'inasim kiksavam v'chizmanam. These days of Purim are remembered and the mitzvahs are performed, kiksavam, as they're written in the Megillah, v'chizmanam, and in their proper times. What the Gemara darshans is, ma asiya lemafreya loi, the same way the mitzvahs hayayim of Purim cannot be done out of order. What does that mean that they're not done out of order? Well, the pasuk says, kiksavam v'chizmanam. We know that there are two different days, there are two different zmanim given for the mitzvahs of Purim. There's Yodalid and Tesvav. Open cities, most of the world, they keep the mitzvahs hayom of Purim on Yodalid. On Ir Mukaf Chayma Mimos Yeshua Benun, they keep the mitzvahs of Purim on Tesvav. Now, you can't flip Yodalid and Tesvav. It's impossible for the 15th day of the month to come before the 14th day of the month. Therefore, the same way the Zman for the Asiya cannot be done out of order, the Zechira, which is the commemorating of the Nes of Purim, which is the laning of the Megillah, also cannot be done out of order. So this halacha, the HaKorei HaMegillah lemafreya, the Chazal darshan from a pasuk in the Megillah. Continues the Mechaber. Now he gives an example of laning the Megillah out of order. Kara pasuk echad. Let's say you laned the first pasuk of the Megillah. V'dilek hasheni. So you laned pasuk aleph, and then you skipped pasuk beis. V'kara shlishi. And now you laned pasuk gimel. So you laned pasuk 1, then pasuk 3. V'achakach chazar v'kara hasheni. Then you realize that you skipped pasuk beis, so you go back to pasuk beis. So far you did aleph, gimel, and then you went back to beis. Now you went ahead and you went to dalid. So you did 1, 3, 2, 4. Says the Mechaber, lo yotza, you're not yotza. Mipnei shekar lo mafreya pasuk echad. Because you laned pasuk number 2 out of order. You did 1, 3, then you went back to 2, and then you went to 4. So pasuk beis was done out of order, and you are not yotza. Ella rather, says the Mechaber, ketzad yaseh, what should you do? Well, obviously you should lane the whole Megillah in order. But if you laned pasuk aleph, and then you skipped pasuk beis, and you went to pasuk gimel, and now you realize your mistake, what should you do? You should go back to pasuk beis, and then repeat pasuk gimel, and go weiter. That way there's nothing out of order. Says the Mechaber, Elaketz Yaseh, rather what should you do? Maschil mi pasuk sheni. In this case, where you skipped pasuk sheni, you went from 1 to 3, and now you went back to 2. Maschil mi pasuk sheni. Start again from the second pasuk for pasuk beis sheshachach that you skipped. The kare ala seder, and go straight. So again, if you did 1 and then 3, and then you realized and you went back to 2, you don't now skip 3 and go to 4. Because if you do that, then pasuk 2 and pasuk 3, pasuk beis and pasuk gimel were flipped. You didn't do 1, 2, 3. You did 1, 3, 2, and then 4. Instead, what you do is 1, 3, then go back to 2, do 3 again, and then 4, and then 5, and so on and so forth. If you do it that way, you laned the whole Megillah properly in order. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Chav Beis. Oh, you know what? We didn't read the entire Chav Aleph. Mishnah Berurah Chav Aleph. Lamafreya, you lane the Megillah out of order. Hainu shakar psukim achreinim kaidim shakar psukim rishayim. You laned later psukim before you laned earlier psukim. Va'afil rak pasuk echad l'kameh. We did do this. V'adin echad shakar parsha shtir kaidim l'rishayim. Ice cut chav beis. V'dileg hasheni. If you laned the first pasuk, then you skipped the second pasuk. V'kara shlishi, and then you laned the third pasuk. So you did 1, 3. And then you went back to 2. In the case of the Mechaber, what the Mechaber says is, you did 1, then you skipped 2. So you did 1, 3, then you went back to 2, then you went back to 4. Says the Mishnah Berurah, doesn't have to be that exact case. For who adin, the same halachah would apply in kara achara dilug kol ha-Megillah. Let's say you did 1 and then 3. And then you didn't go back to 2. You did 1 and then 3, and then you laned the whole Megillah. And then you realized that you skipped pasuk beis, so you went back to pasuk beis. Pasuk beis is still out of order. Or let's say you laned the whole first parak, but you skipped pasuk beis, and at the end of the first parak, you realize that you skipped pasuk beis, so you go back to pasuk beis. Still in all, pasuk beis was done out of order. V'achakach kara pasuk adilug lo yotza, you're not yotza. V'hu adin im kara teva achas lamafreya. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the same halacha applies if you lane one word out of order. So you were laning a pasuk, you skipped the word, then you went back to that word, and then you skipped the words that you laned already, and you went weiter. You have words that are out of order. Kol zeh b'klal lamafreya. All of this is included in the halacha of HaTorah Megillah lamafreya. V'tzarech lachzer v'likrais al haseder. You have to go back to what you skipped, and then you have to lane the entire Megillah in its proper order. The Mechaber, in his case, he said, you did 1, 3, then you went back to 2. He says, you're not yotza. Why are you not yotza? Because after you went back to 2, then you skipped 3 and you went to 4. So the Mechaber didn't spell that out. So the Mishnah Berurah says it. Hainu, this case that you're not Yoitza is Bekare Achakach Pasuk Revi. You did 1, 3, 2, and then instead of doing 3 again, you skipped 3, and you went to 4. So you did 1, 3, 2, 4. What you should have done was 1, 3, 2, and then 3, 4, 5, and so on. And that's what the Mechaber spells out when he continues at the end of the Sif. And he says, Eliketzad Yaseh, what should you have done? You should have been Maschel mi Pasuk Sheni. You should have started over again from Pasuk Beis and gone on in order. Okay, now we go to Sif Zayin. Says the Mechaber, HaKorei es HaMegillah al peh. If you lane the Megillah bal peh, you don't lane it mitoich haksav. You don't lane it from a Megillah. Lo yotza yedei chayvasai. You're not yotza your chiv. Now this halacha might sound very familiar. The reason it sounds very familiar is because the Mechaber already said it in Sif Gimel. The Mechaber said in Sif Gimel on Kuf Dun Daled Amad Aleph, Tzarech lekroisa kula, you have to lane the entire Megillah, umitoich haksav, you have to lane it from a sefer, ve'im kara al peh lo yotza, and if you lane it bal peh, you're not yotza. Here in Sif Zayin, the Mechaber repeats the same exact halacha over again. Let's see Mishnah Berurah Chaf Daled for his explanation of why the Mechaber did so. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kfar ksavaya Mechaber le'el b'Sif Gimel. The Mechaber already said this halacha earlier in Sif Gimel. The Chazar ushena oikan, and he repeats it and he states it over again over here. Mishum dehiske lahatik kan lashon harambam. Because over here, the Mechaber is now quoting verbatim the next several halachos from the words of the Rambam, B'Sif Zayin Ulahalon. Beginning Sif Zayin, the Mechaber is quoting the Rambam. Al-Kain, therefore, He'etik Kaseder HaKosav Sham, since he's now switching to quote the Rambam, he reads verbatim from the Rambam, including this halacha of the Rambam's. V'sham maschil medina dekar al peh ayin sham. And the Rambam begins with this halacha stating that you're not allowed to lane the Megillah bal peh. Now, what was the Rambam? What was the Mechaber doing until now? Until Sif Zayin, what was he doing? Says the Chafetz Chaim in the Sharetzion is cut lechav beis. Ubesif Gimel nimshach achar lashon HaTorah bedina detzarach lekroisa kula v'hetik sham kil shainai. Over there in Sif Gimel, the Mechaber was quoting the Torah. The Torah says that you have to lane the entire Megillah, and then he says the halacha that you're not allowed to lane the Megillah bal peh. So the Mechaber over there in Sif Gimel was quoting the Torah. So he quoted the Torah in its entirety. Now he's switching over to the Rambam, so now he's quoting the Rambam in his entirety. Okay, now we go to Sif Ches. Says the Mechaber, Haloyes sheshama es ha-Megillah. Somebody who speaks a foreign language, who hears the Megillah, haksuva b'lashon hakodesh, he hears the laning of the Megillah from a Megillah that's written in Lashon HaKodesh. Now the words we have next are ubikisvei HaKodesh. The Chafetz Chaim tells us that it's supposed to say ubiksav HaKodesh, and it's written in the ksav HaKodesh, which the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us means ksav ashuris, the way we write a Sefer Torah. So what do we have here? We have a loyes, we have somebody who speaks a foreign language. He heard the Megillah laned in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, from a Megillah that's written in Lashon HaKodesh, in Ksav Ashuris. Says the Mechaber, Af al pi she'einu yedea mahem oimrim, even though he has not a clue what's being said, he doesn't understand the word. So this fellow speaks English, he reads English, he does not understand Lashon HaKodesh, maybe he doesn't even read Lashon HaKodesh. He goes to shul, and he hears the Megillah laned in Lashon HaKodesh from a Megillah written in Lashon HaKodesh in Ksav Ashuris. Says the Mechaber, Yotza Yedei Chayvasai. He's Yotza his Chiyav anyway, even though he does not understand a word. So this is the first halacha that we're going to have over here, Benagea to the question of the Megillah written and read in different languages. The baseline that the Mechaber wants to establish is if you have a Megillah that's written in Hebrew in Ksav Ashuris, and somebody takes that Megillah and lanes from that Megillah in Hebrew, then if somebody is listening to that Megillah, even if he does not understand a word of Hebrew, he's Yaitze his Chiyuv anyway. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chav Hey. Ubekisvei HaKodesh. Tzarech Loimar, the Chavetz Chaim says this is a textual error. What it should say is Biksav HaKodesh. The Megillah was written in Ksav HaKodesh. V'chein HaGirsa Barambam. Again, this is taken verbatim from the Rambam, so that's the actual text of the Rambam. It says Biksav HaKodesh, or Ritzaynai Loimar, and what the Mechaber and the Rambam want to say is Biksav Ashuris. It was written in Ashuris, the way we write the Sefer Torah. Ois Katan Chavav, Yatza Yedei Chayvasai. This fellow, who does not understand a word of Hebrew, is Yaitze his Chiyuv of Mikra Megillah anyway. The Chavetz Chaim explains why, and this is taken from the Gemara in Megillah. I believe it's either Yud Ches Amud Aleph, Yud Zayin Amud Beis. The Gemara says, Taha ha'achashtronim b'nei haramochim. We have words in the Megillah where it's stated that Mordechai sent the achashtronim b'nei haramochim to announce the new Gezerah after Haman's decree was nullified. So Mordechai and Esther, they sent out new messengers, and it says that they sent the achashtronim b'nei haramochim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, quoting the Gemara in Megillah, Gamanan lo yadinan mahu. We don't know what achashtronim b'nei haramochim means. We don't know if this is referring to certain types of animals. It's talking about very fast horses, very fast donkeys. We don't know exactly what this means. And yet, we're Yaitze the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah anyway. There's no choice. We don't know what it means. Nobody knows what it means. Gamanan lo yadinan mahu. We don't know what it means. And still, obviously, we're Yaitze the mitzvah. Ella, what do you see from here? Loi ba'inan ela mitzvahs kriya upersume nisa. What is required to be Yaitze the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah is not that you need to understand what is being read. You don't need to. As long as it's being read from a kosher Megillah, it's being said in Hebrew, read from a Hebrew Megillah written in Ashuris. Even if you don't understand a word, you're Yaitze. How do we know? Because we always don't understand some words of the Megillah, because we don't know what achashtronim b'nei haramochim means. And in the Gemara doesn't tell us what achashtronim b'nei haramochim means, and the Gemara holds out achashtronim b'nei haramochim as an example. That automatically there are words we don't know what they mean. So you see that you're Yaitze without knowing what it means. And not only that, says the Mishnah Berurah, he's quoting this from a Ritva, Va'afilu lechatchila nami. We must say that this is a lechatchila. Because again, if the Gemara tells us that we're Yaitze the Megillah without knowing what achashtronim b'nei haramochim means, it's not a b'di'evid. Clearly, it's not a b'di'evid. And therefore, women who back in the day were very uneducated, they didn't understand Hebrew, they were Yaitze Mikra Megillah. We learned that they're Chayiv in Mikra Megillah. Doesn't say anywhere that we have to establish shiurim for the women to know or to understand the words of the Megillah, and Amei Ha'aretz. Amei Ha'aretz are also Yaitze. So clearly you see that even lechatchila, you could be Yaitze the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah without understanding anything. And why is that, said the Mishnah Berurah? Because loy ba'inan ela mitzvahs kriya u'persume nisa. We need a kriya, we need to hear a kriya, and we need parsume nisa. Now you might ask the question, how is there parsume nisa if nobody's going to understand what it says in the Megillah? If you're telling me you're not chayiv to understand what it says in the Megillah, so what if nobody understands what it says in the Megillah? How are you makayim parsume nisa? So if you take a look at Dirshu, footnote number 26, they tackled this question. It says over here, V'ha'oifen boi miskayim etzlam parsume nisa. What is the form that this parsume nisa takes if people don't understand what it says in the Megillah? Av she'ena mevina ma she'shoymim, even if they don't know what they're hearing. The answer is to be found in a Rashi, Megillah Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Pirish Rashi, she'shoyalim es hashoymim ha'acherim. There's going to be somebody in shul who knows what the Megillah means. So the people who don't understand what the Megillah means, everybody's coming to shul, Berurah Am Hadras Melech, they're all gathering around to hear the Megillah. So people are going to go over to the other people in shul. The Elu Oimrim Lehem Ma Inyana Shel Kriyazu. And they'll say, okay, we'll tell you what the story of Purim is. You don't understand what we just learned? I'll tell you what it says. Vashteta. Ve'echaya Hanesa, what the Nisim were. Rambam Pirish, Sha'av She'ena Mevinim Kol Mila Mila. The truth is, even if the people don't understand every word of the Megillah, Mevinim Aim is Klala Inyan. They all know the basic story of the Megillah. Yeah, Vashti was killed. Esther was chosen to replace her. We had somebody in the Beis HaMelech. There was Mordechai. There was a plot of Bixen and Seresh. Haman came along. He made a terrible gzera. Mordechai got Esther to go to Achashverosh. Achashverosh nullified the decree. Hung Haman, replaced Haman with Mordechai. Mordechai sent out a new decree. Let's eat, let's celebrate. So the basic story of Purim, they know. So they come to shul, they hear the Megillah, they know that the Megillah is the story of Purim. Okay, there's a lot of words in the Megillah, they don't know exactly what's going on, pasuk by pasuk, but they understand the basic of the Inyan. So the Kriya, even though the people don't know Lashon HaKodesh, it still creates a Persume Nisa, so you're still Mekayim the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, and like we saw from the Ritva, even Lechatchila. Now, the Mishnah Berurah here in Chavav continues, and at first, it was very confusing to me why the Mishnah Berurah places this halacha here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kasav HaPri Megadim, the Pri Megadim writes, Kol Yarei Shamayim, for every Yarei Shamayim, Nachain, it would be proper, Sheyiyaloi Megillah Keshera B'yadai, that he should be holding a kosher Megillah in his hands during the Kriyas HaMegillah, Velikrai mila mila bilechisha, and he should read together with the Balkaira word by word quietly. Why? Because it's impossible to accurately hear every word from the Balkaira. Certainly nowadays, where the kids are busy clapping Haman and they're making a rash gudel, and it's very hard to make sure that you heard every word of the Megillah. Now, what was confusing to me is there's two questions over here. First of all, why is the Chavetz Chaim telling me this halacha here? The Chavetz Chaim has already told me this halacha a couple of times, that it would be proper for every Yerei Shamayim to have a Megillah, a kosher Megillah, and to read along with the Megillah. Why suddenly is the Chavetz Chaim telling me this halacha here in Taf Reish Tzadik Sif Ches in Mishnah Berurah Eiskat Chavav? Ma inyan le'inyanenu? What's it doing in middle of Eiskat Chavav? So when I looked up the Pri Megadim, I found out the answer. The answer is because the Pri Megadim takes this from a Ran. He's quoting a Ran in Masechtas Megillah. And the Ran says it because of the Gemara that we just spoke about over here. We just said over here that you could be Yotze Yochiev of Mikra Megillah even though you don't understand what the words mean. Why? Because it says Achashtrana B'nei Ramachim, and none of us know what the words Achashtrana B'nei Ramachim mean. So it must be that you could be Yotze Mikra Megillah without knowing what the words mean. Comes along the Ran, and the Ran makes an interesting diuk from the Gemara. The Ran says, I don't understand. Not so fast. Maybe you really do have to know what the words of the Megillah mean. But we learned already earlier that there are certain words of the Megillah that we learned that you have to lane the Megillah mitoch haksav, but really you only have to lane roiv of the Megillah mitoch haksav. If you laned a miut of the Megillah, if you laned a minority portion of the Megillah Bal Peh, b'di'eved, you're Yotze. So says the Ran, maybe we could extrapolate from that halacha that really, if you skip a couple of words totally, forget that you laned them, but you laned them Bal Peh. Maybe even if you skip a few words from the Gemara, from the Megillah, and you never laned them at all, maybe you're also Yotze. Maybe the same way you could lane a small portion of the Megillah Bal Peh, and you still Yaitza. Maybe you could also skip a few words from the Megillah totally and still be Yaitza. Says the Ran, we know that that's not true from this Gemara. Because the Gemara says, how do I know that you could be Yaitza without understanding the Megillah? Because we don't understand what Achashtronim and Aramachim means. Now, if it was true that you could be Yaitza, even if you skip a few words, then the Gemara wouldn't have a raya. Because we would just say, the fact that you don't know what Achashtronim and Aramachim means, you could still be Yaitza, not because you don't know what it means, because you're Yaitza even if you didn't lane it at all. If you skip Ha'achashtronim b'nei Haramachim, 3 words, maybe you're Yaitza. If you skip 3 words from the Megillah totally. So, fine, you don't know what it means. So it's as if you never laned it. Fine, but even if you didn't lane it, you're Yaitza anyway. Elamai, says the Ran, must be that that's not true. It must be that you're not allowed to skip any words from the Megillah. Oh, now that we know you're not allowed to skip any words from the Megillah, now we have a raya, Ha'achashtronim b'nei Aramachim, you don't know what they mean, you can see that you're Yaitza in the Megillah anyway, even without knowing what words mean. But what you see from here is that you're not allowed to skip any words from the Megillah. Based on that, says the Ran, since you're not allowed to skip any words from the Megillah, it's important that every person should have a kosher Megillah. That way, if he misses anything that the Baal Korah said, he could say it for himself from the Megillah. So this idea that every Yerei Shamayim should have a Megillah comes from the Gemara that the Chavetz Chaim brings down, quotes in the beginning of Ois Katan Chavav, the Gemara about Achashtronim b'nei Aramachim, and that's why he mentions the halachah over here. That was the first question. The second question that I had was, why does the Chavetz Chaim say that you should have a kosher Megillah, v'likroi mila memila b'lechisha, and you should lane every word quietly together with the Shliach Tzibur? Why is that? We learned earlier that if you're laning from a chumash, you should lane quietly, right? We had that earlier. Sif Dalid, the previous page, Kuf Nun Dalid Amud Beis, Sif Dalid. The Mechaber said, Mi she'toifis biyada Megillah she'ena kshera. If you're holding a Megillah that's not kosher, or let's say a chumash, lo yikre im shliach tzibur, you shouldn't lane along with the shliach tzibur, ela shemei v'shoisik. You should listen and you should be quiet. And the Mishnah Berurah explained, why is that? The reason is because we're afraid if you lane together with the shliach tzibur and you lane out loud, somebody might hear your laning and he might pay attention to your laning, but not to the Baal Korah's laning. In that case, he's hearing from you, you're laning from a chumash, or you're laning from a pasuk Megillah. That's a problem. Therefore, the Mechaber said, don't lane, you should just listen, but don't lane together with the Baal Korah. But over here in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Chavav, the Chavetz Chaim is talking about somebody who has a kosher Megillah. So why does he have to lane quietly? If somebody else hears you laning, so what? You laned from a kosher Megillah. What's the problem? So why does the Chavetz Chaim say here, Kol Yerei Shamayim nachay sheyeloi Megillah kshera b'yadai v'likrei mila b'mila b'lechisha? Why quietly? Why can't you lane out loud? The answer to this question is to be found on Kuf Nun Daled Amud Beis in Sharat Tzion Ois Katan Yud Aleph. Says the Chavetz Chaim, and he quotes this from the Magen Avram. Ulefi tam zeh, for the same reason that you have to make sure to lane quietly if you have a pasuk Megillah. Again, why do you have to lane quietly if you have a pasuk Megillah? Because somebody else might be listening to you instead of to the Baal Korah. Says the Sharat Tzion, says the Chavetz Chaim, for the same reason, af im Korah mitoich Megillah kshera, even if you're laning from a kosher Megillah, gam kein yesh lizar likroi balachash, you still should make sure to lane quietly. Why? Why? You're laning from a kosher Megillah. What's the problem? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, v'loy l'sayei alachazin, don't lane loud, helping out the Baal Korah. Why? Unless im loy kishem mechaven ha'mesayeya lahoitzi L'chol mi sheyitein leiv likriyasai v'loy l'shliach tzibur. Don't lane together. Excuse me 1 second there. Yeah. Don't lane together with the Balkari out loud unless you have in mind to be mitzi somebody who's listening to you. See, the problem is like this. It's very nice that you have a kosher or Megillah, but when you're laning together with the Balkari from your kosher or Megillah, do you have in mind to be mitzi other people? No. You just want to protect yourself. You're afraid that you might have missed a word. So you want to cover yourself by laning from your Megillah. But you don't have in mind to be mitzi somebody else who's listening to you. And what did we learn? We learned echad hakoyrei ve'echad hashemeya min hakoyrei. Both one who lanes the Megillah or one who listens to the Megillah, yotza yedei chayvasai v'hu sheyishma mipi mushur chayiv. Right? And what did we say? What did we say? Not over here, not over here. Oh, I put the wrong place. Where is it? We learned that you have to have kavana to be mitzi the person who's listening to you. Okay, I'm not going to spend my time searching for it over here. But we learned beferish that the one who's laning the Megillah has to have in mind to be mitzi the people that are listening. And if you go ahead and you're laning out loud together with the shliach tzibur, but you don't have in mind to be mitzi the people that are listening, that is going to create a problem. So that's why over here, the Chavetz Chaim says, even if you have a kosher or Megillah, you should only lane mila b'mila be'lechisha. Okay, that finishes off Sif Ches. Now let's go to Sif Tes. Sif Tes is a little bit complicated, but let's chew our way through it. Says the Mechaber Sif Tes. So we just established in Sif Ches, if you have a Megillah that's written in Hebrew, in Ksav Ashuris, and somebody lanes from it in Hebrew, everybody who listens is Yotzei, even if they don't understand a word of Lashon HaKodesh, they're Yotzei anyway. Now let's go to Siftes. Haisa Ksuva Targum. Let's say the Megillah was not written in Lashon HaKodesh. It was written in Targum. It was written in Aramaic. Oy, B'Lashon HaCheres, B'Lashon HaAkum. Or it was written in some other non-Jewish language. It was written in English. It was written in French. La yotza yedei chayvasai b'kriyasa. You're not yotza by laning from that Megillah. Ella hamakir oisai aloshen belvad. Only somebody who knows that language. So, you have an English Megillah. And it was in the days of Achashverosh. He was Achashverosh who reigned from Haidu until Kush. So you have a Megillah that's written in English. Now, right away, most people are probably thinking, I can't be Yaitse with a Megillah written in English. Now, we're going to see later on that indeed we're not knowing that way. But technically speaking, somebody who understands English could be Yaitse from a Megillah that's written in English. Haisa Ksuva Targum, you had a Megillah that was written in Aramaic. Aramaic is not Lashon HaKodesh. Or in any other non-Jewish language. You can't be Yoitze with the Kriya from that Megillah, Ella only somebody who understands that language. Somebody who understands that language could be Yoitze. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Chazayin. Haisa Ksuva Targum. Va'afilu aksav hayaksav ashuris. This is true even if the Megillah was written in Ksav Ashuris. Now, if the Megillah was written in Targum, in Aramaic, we understand very simply what it means that it was written in Ashuris. We're very used to reading Targum Onkelos from a Chumash, and it's written with Hebrew letters. So yeah, we could easily understand a Megillah that's written in Targum in Ksav Ashuris. But there's also such a thing as a Megillah that's written in English in Ksav Ashuris. What is that? It's not written in English characters. It's not written in ABC. It's transliterated into Hebrew characters. So, and it was in the days of Achashverosh. So you're going to write and, Aleph Nun Daled, and. It was, I don't know, Aleph Tes, it, there's no W, was, Vav, Vav, Aleph Saf, it was. So you transliterate the Megillah from English into Hebrew, and you write it in Ksav Ashuris. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if you did that, even if the Megillah was transliterated and written with Hebrew characters in Ksav Ashuris, but essentially it's a Megillah written in a different language. If you don't understand that language, you're not Yoitza. Gam kein lo yotza misheina makra loshin. Somebody who doesn't understand the language is not Yoitza. So the only automatic is a Hebrew Megillah written with Hebrew characters in Ksav Ashuris. A laning from that Megillah, anybody is Yoitza, whether they understand it or whether they don't. An English Megillah, you lane from an English Megillah, somebody who understands English could be Yoitza. The Megillah is written in English. The Baal Korah reads it from the Megillah in English. Somebody who understands English could be Yoitza. But somebody who does not understand English is not Yoitza. And that's true even if the Megillah was written with Hebrew characters. It was English transliterated into Hebrew and written in Ksav Ashuris. Doesn't help. Since it's English, you don't understand English, you're not Yoitza. Okay, that was the first halachah of Siftes. Second halachah of Siftes. Right by the Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Chav Ches. Says the Mechaber, Aval, however, Im Hoisa Ksuva Biksav Ivri. Let's say it's written in Hebrew. Ukira'a Aramis la'arami. So now you have a Hebrew Megillah, but the person sitting in front of you doesn't know Hebrew. You want to lane it for him in a language that he understands. So you have a Megillah that's written B'Ksav Ivri. It's written in Hebrew. The Mishnah Berurah says in Eis Katan Chav Tes, I know we skipped Chav Ches, but in Eis Katan Chav Tes, the Mishnah Berurah says, Ritzayna Loimar Balashon Ivri. This is a Hebrew Megillah. Ukra'a Aramis la'arami. You looked in the Megillah, but you know that this person doesn't understand Hebrew. So instead of reading it to him in Hebrew, you read it to him in Aramish. You read it to him in Aramaic. Lo yotza. Then you're not Yoitza. Why, says the Mechaber? Shenimtza zeh karei al peh. Because that's called laning the Megillah bal peh. You didn't lane the Megillah mitay chaksav. You have a Hebrew Megillah in front of you. But you know that this, fresh Baal Tshuva in front of you doesn't understand a word of Hebrew. And you think you want to do a good thing. You want this person to know what Vashtetu, what does it say in the Megillah? So you decide that instead of reading the Megillah to him or her in Hebrew, you're going to read it to him in English. So you have the Megillah, and you're looking in the Megillah. You see, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, but you lane, and it was in the days of Achashverosh, he was Achashverosh, who reigned from Haidu until Cush, 7 and 20 and 100 Midinis, 127 Midinis. So, in a sense, are you laning mitay chaksav? In a sense, you're laning mitay chaksav, because you're looking in the Megillah, you're translating, and then you're giving over a translation to the person who's listening. But the Mechaber says, no, that's not called mitay chaksav. That's called al peh. Because are the words that you're saying written in the Megillah? No, the Megillah is written in Hebrew. You're talking English. So the words that you're saying are not in the Megillah. And therefore, to recap this second halachah in Siftes, let's read it inside, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines to the bottom, by the Eis Katan Chav Ches for the Mishnah Berurah. Aval, however, im ha'isa ksuva b'ksav ivri, if the Megillah is written in Hebrew, ukira'a aramis la'arami, but you translate it, and you read it in Aramaic to somebody who speaks Aramaic, lo yotza. That person is not yotza. Why? Shenimtza zeh karei al peh. Because in essence, you're reading the Megillah bal peh. You're not reading Vashteit. You're not reading what's written in the Megillah. In that case, even you can't be Yotze with your own Kriya, because you're leaning Balpeh. And therefore, certainly, the one who's listening to you certainly can't be Yotze. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chavches, Avol im Hoisa Ksuva. What the Mechaber says was, it was written in Hebrew, but you didn't read it in Hebrew. You translated it to Aramaic. What the Mechaber wants to say is, Ema Samrinan, when do we say the first halachah of Siftes that we just said? Again, what was the first halachah? The first halachah was, if you have a Megillah written in English, and you read it in English to a person who understands English, that person is Yotze. The Megillah is written in English, you read it in English, and the person understands English. Then the person is Yotze. Now comes along the Mechaber, Ritzayna Loimar, and now what the Mechaber wants to say is, when do we say that the one listening to the laning could be Yotze with the laning if he understands that language? Only if the one who's laning from the Megillah reads the Megillah in the language in which it is written. Aval imatik, but if he translates, aval imatik zeh haloshin, but if the reader translates the language that the Megillah is written in, liloshan acher, to a different language. The Megillah is written in Hebrew, and the one who's reading the Megillah translates it to English and reads an English translation instead of the Hebrew. Even if the one who's listening understands English and Hebrew, they're not Yotze. And the reason is, as the Mechaber is going to explain, because this is a Kriya al Peh. You're laning the Megillah al Peh. You're not laning what it says in the Megillah. The Mechaber said the Megillah was written in Ksav Ivri. Ritzayna Loimar, what he means to say B'lashon Ivri in Hebrew. Lamid Ukra'a Aramis la'Arami. So the Megillah was written in Hebrew, but the reader translated it into Aramaic and read it in Aramaic to somebody who speaks Aramaic. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ashmi'inan, the Chiddush over here is, Ta'afal Gavsha HaMegillah Lefanov, even though the Baal Koreh has a Megillah in front of him, v'hu ma'ayin b'chol teva, and he's looking at every word in the Megillah, u'mitargam lahashameya, and then he's translating it to the listener. V'hava amina, I might have thought, zeh odif mikarei al peh. I would have thought maybe that's better than reading it bal peh, because the reader is looking in the Megillah to decide what he's going to say. Kamash Balam de Gabazel lo Yotze. The Mechaber is teaching me, no, you can't be Yotze. Oiskot lamanaf lo Yotze. Ritzana Loimar, when the Mechaber says you're not Yotze, he means Hashemeya, even the listener is not Yotze, even though he understands what he's hearing. The reader is translating it into Aramaic or English or French or Spanish, and the one who's listening understands that language, but he's still not Yotze, because the Kriya is a Kriya al Peh. Kevan Chahakore Kriya al Peh, because this is called a Kriya al Peh. Ve'ena Chashiva Kriya afla atzmai. And even for the Baal Koreh, this doesn't constitute a proper Kriya. Like Adif Hashemeh Mimenu, certainly the one who's listening is not better than the one that's laning. Okay, now says the Ramah, Haga, Aval ein lachush be'ezek ksav ksuva. But we don't have to worry, ultimately, what language the Megillah is written in. What does that mean? Says the Mishnah Berurah, what the Ramah wants to say is, Deloi kaptidan sheyehe dafka haksav shaloshen zeh shekoire. Now the Ramah is teaching me another halachah. So we said like this, if the Megillah is written in English, and the reader reads it in English, and the listener understands English, you could be Yotze. Now, says the Ramah, we don't care what kind of characters the Megillah is written in. What does that mean? Afilu haya haloshin giftis. Even if the language of the Megillah was this language called Coptic. V'ha'oisiyos kasav elamus. But the characters are Elami characters, or some other form of that. What that means is like this. Let's say the language that the Megillah is written in is English. But the characters are the characters of a different language. So it's transliterated from Cyrillic to English. So the Megillah is not written using regular English characters. It's written using Russian characters, but it's transliterated English. So it is written in English. Nami Shari. That's what the Ramah means to tell me here, that ein lochish be'ez ksav ksuva. We're not makbid on the writing. If the Megillah is written in English, but it's not using English characters, it's transliterated using other characters, but it's written in English, and the reader reads it in English, and the listener understands English, he could be yoitze even though it's not written in English characters. But the one who's reading it has to know those characters. He has to understand those characters because he has to be reading mitach haksav. Because if not, heavy bechlal al peh, then it becomes again kriya al peh. Al peh kishein makir. Okay, avakama paiskim cholkim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, many paiskim disagree with this. Usvira lahu, they hold the Megillah b'chaloshet shehi, a Megillah, whatever language it's written in, einak she'er likrais ba va'afilu loloyes. You cannot use it to read it, even to somebody who understands that language, ela b'sha'aksav shala ashuris, unless it's written in ashuris. So says the Chavetz Chaim here, many paiskim disagree with this Ramah, and they say that when is it true that a Megillah could be written in English, read in English, and if the listener understands English, he's Yaitza, only if it's English transliterated into Hebrew and written in Ksav Ashuris. Vayin b'bir halachah. Kasav Pri Begadim writes, Emaisa Ksuva Ksav Uloshin Targum v'chadoima, if it's written in the Ksav of Targum and the language of Targum, v'hakore eino mevin Targum, the Balkore doesn't understand Targum. So what if you have a Megillah that's written in English, and the Ksav is English, and the listener understands English, but the Balkore doesn't understand English? So then, says the Pri Megadim, the listener is not Yoitze, even according to the Mechaber. V'chein hu hadin, so too, if the Balkore does understand it, and is written in that language, if the listener doesn't understand that language, so it works both ways. Both the reader and the listener have to understand the language that the Megillah is written and laned in. Mihu, and now finally, and we'll close with this, now comes the punchline over here in the Mishnah Berurah. After all is said and done, Mihu, however, Naihagin bizman hazeh, we are noig bizman hazeh, likrais hakol b'lashon hakodesh, to only lay in the Megillah lashon hakodesh, ulakosva v'kisvei oisi ois hakodesh, and only to write them in ashuris, and this is brought down from the Lavush, and that is the minig, and that is what we do, and we don't rely on any of these other kulas. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shem should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnasah, sheduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Gael Tzedek, but Meher of Yameinu, Amen. Be well.